My name is Jonathan Parsons, and I teach philosophy at College of DuPage. In this video, I am going to discuss the vagueness argument for unrestricted composition, which originally appeared in philosopher David Lewis's work, Parts of Classes. Suppose I am sitting with my son at the dinner table, and we are sorting his Halloween candy into daddy piles and child piles. Since this video is not on ethics, let's ignore the fact that I fully intend on the final daddy pile being much larger than the child pile. After doing this for several minutes, I need to leave my son alone for a moment, and before I leave, I say, there had better still be a daddy pile of candy here when I get back. However, as my son is looking at the piles of candy, he starts thinking about the determinate number of pieces that make up a pile. More specifically, my son asks, how many individual pieces of candy can I take from the daddy pile before there is no longer a pile? Let's say initially I have 10 pieces of candy. My son takes one piece of candy and eats it. He then takes another piece of candy from my pile and puts it in his own pile. He then takes a third piece of candy, and a fourth, and a fifth, and so on. Suppose when I return to the dining room table, there are only 2 pieces of candy left. Is there still a daddy pile of candy or not? If not, at what point did the daddy pile of candy cease to exist? Which piece of candy made the difference? If I have grounds to protest and say, no 2 pieces of candy compose a pile, do I also have grounds to say no 3, or 4, or 5 pieces of candy compose a pile? What my son and I are doing here is speculating about the nature of composition, the conditions in which any 2 or more things make up some other thing. One who accepts unrestricted composition says that composition always occurs, and there are no special conditions under which it occurs. More formally, the doctrine of unrestricted composition says that for any disjoint x's, necessarily there is some y such that the x's compose y. So if unrestricted composition is true, my 2 pieces of candy necessarily compose something. However, the truth of unrestricted composition also implies that there is an object composed of my left toe, a buoy in Cape Cod, and the third ring of Saturn. Someone who disagrees with this will either say that composition is restricted or composition never occurs. The position that composition never occurs is known as nihilism, and that will not be addressed in this video. Restricted composition is the position that sometimes composition occurs and sometimes composition does not occur. However, in order for this to be the case, there have to be precise and unique conditions for why some x's sometimes fail to compose something and other times some x's do compose something. Those who adopt unrestricted composition think that such precise and unique specifications for compositions cannot be met, which is why if composition occurs at all, then it must be unrestricted. The vagueness argument is just one way of attempting to show that there cannot be such precise and unique conditions for composition. So let's turn to the argument itself. Here is a simplified version of the argument, popularized by philosopher Ted Sider. Premise 1. If composition is restricted, then sometimes composition occurs and sometimes composition does not occur. Premise 2. If sometimes composition occurs and sometimes composition does not occur, then either there are strict cutoff points for composition, or it is possible for composition to be vague. 3. There are no strict cutoff points for composition, and it is not possible for composition to be vague. Conclusion? Therefore, it is not the case that composition is restricted. Pretty simple, right? But what reasons are there for accepting the premises? Let's return to the candy example that I gave at the beginning of the video. My son wants to know how many pieces of candy he can take from my pile before there is no longer a pile. He wants a strict cutoff point. However, it seems that any cutoff point my son provided as an answer would be completely arbitrary. Why? There is no principled reason why 6 pieces of candy is a better candidate for being a pile than 5 pieces is, or for why 4 pieces is a better candidate than 3 is a better candidate than 2, or even for why 2 pieces of candy is a better candidate for being a pile than 1 piece is. For any line my son draws and says, enough now, I can't take any more candy or else I will eliminate the daddy pile, there is another line my son could have drawn which have been an equally good place to stop taking pieces of candy. The mere number of pieces cannot explain why at some point I have a pile and some other point I don't have a pile. However, it also doesn't seem to be the case that we can specify the relationships that the individual pieces need to stand in order to compose a pile either. Do all of the pieces of candy need to be in contact with each other in order to compose a pile? Or does only a sufficient number of pieces need to be in contact? What is a sufficient number exactly? If the pieces of candy are not touching each other at all, do we simply have a deconstructed pile or a pile that is spread out? If I make a vertical stack of some of the candies, do stacks constitute piles? Or only some of the time do stacks constitute piles? What are the conditions for being a stack? As we can see, providing the precise and unique conditions under which some things compose a complex object like a stack or a pile are not abundantly clear. So, maybe my kids and I just won't go trick-or-treating next year. What of vagueness, then? To say that composition is vague means that it is possible for there to be borderline cases of composition. This means there are not always clear boundaries for when some distinct x's compose some y and when some x's do not compose anything at all. Just to be clear, this is not a claim about our knowledge of the boundaries. This would be an epistemic claim. This is a claim about the facts concerning composition itself and the nature of the parthood relation itself. Part of the reason why David Lewis thinks that the possibility of vague composition is so problematic is because he says that composition either is, or is at least closely analogous to, the identity relation. Since expressions of identity can be captured under the precise specifications of predicate logic, then such expressions cannot be what's called linguistically vague. An example of linguistic vagueness would be a statement like, Jeff is a fast runner. Fast runner is linguistically vague because we lack an appropriate context for understanding what is meant by this description. If we say Jeff is a fast runner compared to Usain Bolt, then Jeff is a particularly fast runner. But if we say that Jeff is a fast runner compared to his 5-year-old child, who is not very fast at all, then this is really not that impressive of a claim. So in cases of linguistic vagueness, providing an appropriate interpretive context can usually clear up any borderline cases. But since predicate logic cannot be linguistically vague, and statements concerning composition and identity can be captured under the precise specifications of predicate logic, the only option is for composition to be metaphysically vague. That being said, here is an argument for why restricted composition is problematic to the extent that it implies metaphysical vagueness. Premise 1. If composition is restricted, then for any distinct x's x1 and x2, it is possibly vague whether x1 and x2 compose some y. Premise 2. For any distinct x's x1 and x2, if it is possibly vague whether x1 and x2 compose some y, then there can be borderline cases of identity, since composition either is or is closely analogous to the identity relation. Premise 3. If there can be borderline cases of identity, then identity statements can have indeterminate truth values. 4. So, for any distinct x's x1 and x2, if it is possibly vague whether x1 and x2 compose some y, then identity statements can have indeterminate truth values. 5. If identity statements can have indeterminate truth values, then it is possible for there to be an indeterminate number of objects in the world. 6. So, for any distinct x's x1 and x2, if it is possibly vague whether x1 and x2 compose some y, then it is possible for there to be an indeterminate number of objects in the world. Conclusion: therefore, if composition is restricted, then it is possible for there to be an indeterminate number of objects in the world. Here's an example that might help clarify this. Let's say within a particular world we know there are at least two objects. Let's just call them A and B. This means we know that A and B are distinct. Now we need to determine whether or not there is some C that is composed of A and B. It is going to be the case that if A and B do compose some object C, then there are exactly 3 objects in the world, and it is also going to be the case that if A and B do not compose C, then there are only 2 objects in the world, just A and B. If it can be vague whether A and B compose C, then according to the argument just outlined, there are exactly 2 objects in the world, and there are exactly 3 objects in the world can have indeterminate truth values. But this seems to be a mistake. Given the precision of the statements, it seems one of them is true and the other is false. But if restricted composition implies that composition is vague, and the vagueness of composition further implies this sort of count indeterminacy, to the extent that we find count indeterminacy problematic, we should also find restricted composition problematic. So, just to recap the vagueness argument for unrestricted composition. The argument says, 1, if composition is restricted, that sometimes composition occurs, and sometimes composition does not occur. Premise 2, if sometimes composition occurs, and sometimes composition does not occur, then either there are strict cutoff points for composition, or it is possible for composition to be vague. Premise 3, there are no strict cutoff points for composition, and it is not possible for composition to be vague. Once again, there cannot be strict cutoff points for composition, since the mere number of x's cannot be the determining factor for when some x's compose some y, and when they do not compose anything at all. And it's also true that we cannot specify the specific relationships the x's need to be in order to compose some y. It's also the case that composition cannot be vague, because vague composition implies vague identity. Vague identity implies that statements of identity can have indeterminate truth values, and statements of identity having indeterminate truth values implies that there can be an indeterminate number of objects in the world. 4, therefore, composition is not restricted. There are other ways of laying out vagueness arguments, but if you find this version interesting, I would appreciate your comments. Also, if you want to look into these issues further, I highly recommend philosopher Dan Corman's book, Objects, Nothing Out of the Ordinary. You can get it online, and I'm sure you can get it at plenty of bookstores near you. Thanks for watching.